Welcome. I'm Colleen Doak. I'm an associate professor at St. Ambrose University within the Masters in Public Health program. In order to fully understand this lecture, it's important for you to know my background. First of all, my perspective is in public health. I teach in the Masters in Public Health program here at St. Ambrose, but I also come from a background of nutrition. My PhD is in nutrition and anthropology. My bachelor's and master's degrees were in anthropology. And so from that perspective, I will draw on both the biological, bioarchaeological context, and from the cultural aspects. From that perspective, I'm going to begin with some of the biological processes of osteoporosis. Understanding the relationship between risk factors for osteoporosis requires understanding the biological process of bone remodeling. So I'm going to start there. But it also relates to the natural process of aging, which links back to the biology. And finally, behavioral interventions also prevent and reduce risk factors for osteoporosis, linking back again to the biological mechanisms. So understanding the biology is the basis for diagnosis and treatment, and then we'll also talk about cultural factors in relation to the biological processes. On the left side of the screen here, I want to introduce some concepts that have to do with understanding osteoporosis, particularly in relation to the process of bone remodeling. So remember osteoclasts. Osteoclasts demineralize. This is a concept we're going to draw on later in the lecture. Osteoblasts rebuild. Peak bone mass is a concept of bone mass that changes with age and has very much to do with the relationship between aging and osteoporosis. And there are environmental factors like calcium intake, vitamin D exposure, and exercise that are related to osteoporosis because of the process of bone remodeling and biological processes related to age. So think about these concepts: osteoclasts, osteoblasts, peak bone mass, calcium, vitamin D, and exercise in relation to bone remodeling, in relation to aging, and how nutrition and exercise relate directly to osteoporosis. So here's the biology of it. Osteoblasts are bone cells that build bone tissue. Osteoclasts, on the other hand, break down bone. So here you see 4 different arrows. One is an arrow to osteoblasts, which form the bone matrix, and osteoclasts, which resorbs bone. So we're going to focus in on osteoblasts and osteoclasts. And the others are also bone cells, and they relate to osteoblasts and osteoclasts, so you'll see them in the book. But really, when we're talking about bone remodeling, focus in on the concept of osteoblasts, which form the bone matrix, and osteoclasts, which resorb bone. Here's a slide that represents the concept of peak bone mass. And on this slide, it shows how skeletal calcium in grams accumulates or diminishes over the life cycle. So starting from age of 0 on the x-axis all the way through past 100, what you see is an accumulation in the very early years related to growth. So it makes sense that skeletal calcium will increase related to growth. Then after height is achieved, you can additionally increase bone mass related to weight-bearing exercise. However, around the time of menopause, there is, related to the loss of estrogen, bone loss. And so this explains how there is a peak in the bone mass sometime between the age of 20 and 40. And then related to menopause, there is a gradual loss of bone that increases women's risk of osteoporosis. From the concept of peak bone mass, I want to talk about why women are more at risk for osteoporosis than men. But first of all, it's very important that you do understand that men also experience bone loss with age and that they do develop osteoporosis. However, they are less at risk than women are because they start with a higher peak bone mass in the first place. Secondly, they have a less dramatic drop in the sex hormones compared to women with age. And third, they also have a lower life expectancy. So as you go on to the right of this diagram, you see that bone loss related to age increases over time. So because women have a longer life expectancy, they also reach the older ages where osteoporosis becomes more severe. You might wonder why I have a picture of two skulls in a slide on osteoporosis. And although these skulls don't represent osteoporosis, they represent the concept that bones are malleable and that they respond to pressure and weight. Human populations have been using this idea that bone responds to weight and pressure to purposely deform and remodel their own physical appearance. So bone responding to weight-bearing exercise also relates to cultural practices of intentional deformation. Skeletal deformation has been used in past populations to either signify elite status or group belonging. So here we have a picture depicted by artist Paul Kane, which shows skull elongation by the First Nations in Canada. The fact that bones respond to both pressure and wear is the reason why forensic anthropologists can identify occupation from the bones. So here I want to illustrate the concept that weight-bearing exercise will change the bones, will make them more dense. And here this can be illustrated by patterns of bony protrusions and wear that you can see in, for example, the foot bones here in an archaeology journal that relate to traditional weaving practices. The foot is sometimes used to maintain tension in traditional Andean weaving, and even that amount of pressure relates to bony protrusions in the areas marked in red. From here out in the lecture, I'm going to go through the major risk factors for osteoporosis, and I'm going to delve into either the biological relationships or the public health epidemiological associations that explain why each of these are major risk factors. So here's my first set of major risk factors for osteoporosis. Looking back on what you know about peak bone mass, it makes sense that age is a major risk factor for osteoporosis. Second of all, vertebral compression fracture and fragility fracture after age of 50 are risk factors because they're associated with the osteoporosis. So they're not actually probably causing the osteoporosis, but these may be early indicators of the osteoporosis that's already starting to occur. A third risk factor relates to family history. So you can imagine, based on the previous slides, that a genetic predisposition could make sense if a family has a likelihood, for example, for early menopause, or may have a predisposition to lower vitamin D levels, or any other biological risk factors that may contribute to either a lower peak bone mass to start with, or a loss of peak bone mass because of early menopause. Malabsorption syndrome related to osteoporosis because, for example, less calcium is absorbed, less vitamin D is absorbed, and those are important for the development of bone. Finally, one of the risk factors identified is systemic glucocorticoid therapy. And this is something that I'm going to delve into more because it's important for understanding other risk factors which come later. There are three main mechanisms of action that explain how glucocorticosteroids could relate to osteoporosis. One is glucocorticosteroids inhibit the replenishment of osteoblasts. Remember, osteoblasts build bone. Second of all, it reduces the action of the osteoblasts that are present. Specifically, it's reducing the synthesis of bone collagen and osteocalcin by the existing osteoblasts. And thirdly, it's reducing intestinal calcium absorption, and it increases renal calcium excretion. And this is through a mechanism related to the parathyroid hormone that I will explain more in depth later in this lecture. So remember the importance of the parathyroid hormone because that's the mechanism of action that relates to the glucocorticosteroids, and how they influence calcium and calcium absorption. The biological mechanisms of glucocorticosteroids relate directly to their treatment to reverse the negative effects of glucocorticosteroids in relation to osteoporosis. So one point of action is oral calcium supplementation, and second has to do with vitamin D. We're going to talk more in depth about vitamin D in relation to calcium and bone health in later parts of this lecture, so hold on to these concepts, but vitamin D3 supplementation becomes important, and or treatment with active vitamin D metabolites such as 1,25-dihydroxyvitamin D3, calcitriol. So remember calcitriol, we're going to come back to that later in this lecture. Other major risk factors relate to primary hyperparathyroidism. So I referred to hyperparathyroidism in previous slides, and I'm going to delve into the parathyroid hormone as part of the mechanism later in this lecture. Propensity to fall, osteopenia, hypogonadism, and early menopause. So the first point, remember I said think about the parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone stimulates bone loss. So primary hyperparathyroidism will be related to osteoporosis because that hormone will increase bone loss. The next 2 points, just like before, here are additionally 2 points that are risk factors, but they're associated with osteoporosis because they may be early phases in that stage of developing osteoporosis. So the tendency to fall is related to strength, which has to do with bone mass. Osteopenia, which is apparent on the X-ray, is also an early stage of osteoporosis, so it may actually simply be an early indicator. Hypogonadism is a condition where the sex hormones are diminished. And sex hormones are related to maintaining and building bone mass for all of the reasons that we talked about when we talked about peak bone mass and age. And also related to sex hormones, early menopause and estrogen deficiency contributes to bone resorption and ultimately bone loss. This list of risk factors mostly relate to behavior patterns or the biological processes of aging. First, with increasing age, it makes sense that people develop rheumatoid arthritis and that when it's painful to move, people will be less active. And we know that lower activity levels relates to osteoporosis through reduced weight-bearing exercise, for example. The second point has to do with dietary intake, and particularly calcium intake. So lower dietary calcium intake will relate to osteoporosis, and I'm going to go in depth into the relationships between dietary calcium, dietary vitamin D, and the parathyroid hormone from this point of the lecture onwards. In addition to dietary calcium, smoking, alcohol, and caffeine are also behavior patterns related to osteoporosis, probably through a mechanism related to acid-base balance. And finally, people with a very low body weight, less than 57 kilograms, or with a high weight loss, greater than 10% of their weight, may be at risk of osteoporosis because they're losing muscle mass, or the weight loss may reflect the loss of the bone mass. So from here out, I'm going to delve into the relationships between dietary calcium intake, blood calcium levels, and bone loss. First of all, blood calcium is tightly regulated. So that's the basic principle behind which low calcium intakes lead to increased loss of bone mass. Low blood calcium is going to lead to loss of bone mass through mechanisms that I'm going to explain here. So first of all, there are calcium sensing receptors in the parathyroid gland. And so when blood calcium goes below a certain threshold, it triggers the release of the parathyroid hormone. And the parathyroid hormone then triggers the osteoblasts, the bone-building cells, to produce proteins that bind to osteoclast precursor cells. They're not osteoclasts yet, they're osteoclast precursor cells. And in that cascade, the precursor osteoblast cells proliferate and differentiate into osteoclasts. So the triggering mechanism goes from parathyroid hormone triggering osteoblasts, which trigger osteoclasts to differentiate, and then osteoclasts release protease enzymes and acids that degrade bone and then release calcium into the blood. So there's a cascade from parathyroid hormone, osteoblasts, to osteoclasts, which then break down the bone and release calcium into the blood. A second mechanism of action that helps to stabilize blood calcium levels relates to the role of the intestines and also dietary intake. The parathyroid hormone again plays a central role here. In the previous slide, parathyroid hormone increased blood calcium levels by triggering a cascade that led to the breakdown of the bone and release of calcium from the bone. In addition to that, the parathyroid hormone also increases the synthesis of calcitriol, which is an active metabolite of vitamin D, from 25-hydroxyvitamin D. And that active form of vitamin D increases the absorption of calcium, and it does that through a vitamin D-dependent membrane channel protein. Specifically, this membrane channel protein is called TRPV6. So in addition to this process, it's also important to know that calcium absorption is also increased by other factors, such as growth hormones in infancy, childhood, and also during pregnancy. So the intestines remains an important way through which calcium levels can be increased. This slide shows a visual representation of different ways where vitamin D increases the absorption of calcium from the diet. Now, the first you've already heard about, and that is the vitamin D-dependent membrane channel protein. It's shown in blue, called TRPV6. So that is upregulated in the presence of vitamin D and the parathyroid hormone. In addition, calbindin shuttles calcium across the cell cytosol and is also vitamin D dependent. And a third pathway is passive paracellular pathway that is upregulated in the presence of vitamin D. So you see 125 dihydroxyvitamin D3 at two different places increases vitamin D absorption either through calbindin or through passive paracellular absorption mechanisms. In addition to vitamin D, there are other dietary factors that also influence the absorption of calcium from the diet. Some dietary factors that increase calcium absorption are sugars like lactose in milk, sugar alcohols, and proteins. But there are a number of dietary factors that reduce calcium absorption, and these are fiber. There are some forms of fiber that directly bind calcium, phytic acid, which is present in whole grains and legumes, oxalic acid, which is present in rhubarb, green leafy vegetables, and blueberries, and divalent minerals like zinc, magnesium, and iron. This diagram shows the whole picture of how blood calcium levels are tightly regulated. So far, we focused only on what happens when blood calcium levels go too low, because that's when the parathyroid hormone stimulates osteoclasts to degrade the bone and release calcium into the blood. And that's the process that contributes to osteoporosis. However, the opposing mechanism of action happens when blood calcium levels go too high. In that case, the thyroid gland releases calcitonin, which opposes the effects of the parathyroid hormone and promotes calcium deposit in the bone by stimulating osteoblast activity. And that is how blood calcium levels then fall and are maintained within a very careful, tight range. In this final slide, I just want to show you the consequences of those biological processes. So the low calcium intake or uptake will lead to the demineralization of bone, resulting ultimately in osteoporosis. I hope that this slide has helped you to understand the process of osteoporosis and its relation to aging. Thank you very much.